Monsignor Shea will spend some time today talking to us about work, life, and mercy. Monsignor Shea was inaugurated in 2009 as the sixth president of the University of Mary. And at the age of 34, he became the youngest college or university president in the United States. The oldest of 8 children, Monsignor Shea grew up on a dairy and grain farm near Hazleton, North Dakota, just 38 miles from the University of Mary campus. He began his undergraduate work at Jamestown College, majoring in English and history. He then entered the seminary for the Diocese of Bismarck, earning a bachelor's degree and a pontifical master's degree in philosophy at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He studied classical Greek at the University of Texas at Austin and continued at the Vatican's North American College, studying theology at the Gregorian and Lateran universities in Rome. He has studied management at the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business and is also an alumnus of the Institutes of Higher Education at the Graduate School of Education, Harvard University. Monsignor Shea has worked with Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity at the Gift of Peace AIDS Hospice while teaching religion at 2 inner-city elementary schools in Washington, D.C. In Rome, he served as chaplain for the Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital and also at the Rome campus of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas. Following his ordination to the priesthood in 2002, he returned to North Dakota and served as an associate pastor in Bismarck and Mandan. During that time, he was also the chaplain and instructor at St. Mary's Central High School here in Bismarck. He then served as pastor in parishes in Kildare and Halliday while teaching at Trinity High School in Dickinson. Deeply committed to the education and formation of young people, he has been an inspirational teacher and mentor for many students. Monsignor Shea is a Knight Commander of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. He has served on the National Advisory Council to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Governor's Commission on Education Improvement for the state of North Dakota. We are very thankful to Eastgate and Parkway Funeral Service for the sponsorship of Monsignor Shea. Please, let us welcome Monsignor James Shea.
Thanks very much. When I gave a talk at the Diocesan Centennial, it was sponsored by the university's attorney. And then today I'm giving a talk on rest, and it's sponsored by Eastgate Funeral Service, which is eternal rest. Anyway, why don't we begin with prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Most high and glorious God, cast your light into the darkness of our hearts. Grant us right faith, firm hope, perfect charity, and profound humility, with perception and understanding, so that we might know and do your holy will. We ask this through Christ our Lord. So I have a PowerPoint here for you today, which I never would have. I understood that I was giving a breakout session, and so I didn't envision that I would be in the arena, so I prepared a PowerPoint, but this is a little less intimate. In any case, I wanted to talk to you today about life and work and mercy. When we had the first Thirst Conference in 2013, the University of Mary conferred upon our special guest, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, an honorary doctorate. When Cardinal Dolan was the rector of the North American College in Rome, where I went to seminary, he used to tell us that the patron saint of preachers and teachers is Saint Dismas, the good thief. And so I want to acknowledge that most of the things that I'll share with you today aren't my ideas. They've been stolen in a good way from other people. Chief among them is one of my heroes, Dr. Michael Naughton, who's the new director of the Center of Catholic Studies. at the University of St. Thomas. In 2006 in Belgium, 10 years ago, Dr. Naughton gave a very interesting talk called A Divided Life, one of the more serious errors for the Christian professional. And that got me thinking a lot about this topic. And in fact, I spend a lot of time thinking about work and life. We live in an age of fragmentation when people all over the place feel like their lives are spinning out of control. People struggle and struggle to find peace, and we feel pulled in so many different directions. The American transcendentalist philosopher and abolitionist Henry David Thoreau wrote in 1854, "Most men live lives of quiet desperation." What a very sad phrase. Live lives of quiet desperation. That was 1854. Today in 2016, perhaps things are much, much worse. We never find ourselves at rest. We don't know who we are or where we're going, and we feel helpless to find our way. St. Benedict, in his rule, is a champion of moderation. But he doesn't mean here some kind of modern concept of work-life balance, which everybody seems to be talking about all the time, but no one ever achieves. You've heard this phrase, haven't you? Work-life balance. St. Benedict says that the leader of the community should carefully arrange everything so that the strong have something to strive for, and so that the weak do not fall back and lose heart in discouragement. This is very beautiful, but also very difficult. So this is the question of our time together this afternoon. What does this true moderation really look like? How can our lives be brought back to themselves, back to who we truly are, back to our best selves? Ora et labora. This is sort of the unofficial phrase of the Benedictine order. Of course, the University of Mary is a foundation of the Benedictine Sisters of Annunciation Monastery. So we think quite a lot about Saint Benedict. The official motto of the Benedictines is that in all things God may be glorified. But something of an unofficial motto is ora et labora, prayer and work. This image, which you see here, is a plate from the Library of Western Michigan University. It's monks at work. What we find in the life of the monastic, the life of the professed religious, is meant to be a profound synthesis between that which is most precious, that which is most valuable, that which is most meaningful in life, and the way that we spend our time. And when we feel our lives pulled apart, when we experience that disintegration that comes from modern life, it's largely because we don't find that synthesis. But in the great monastic tradition, we see a profound synthesis between prayer, intimacy with God, that which is most important, and work, the labor of the hands, and the activity of daily life. This is a challenge for all of us, to integrate what's precious to us and how we spend our time. Here's another image of that life and work, ora et labora. It's a fresco from the 15th century at the Church of San Giovanni a Carbonara in Naples. You see the monks there working. And here's something maybe more familiar. This is a scene from St. Alexius Medical Center, just a couple of blocks from here. Sister Moira Paulus, originally from Wisconsin, was one of the founders of Annunciation Monastery. She died in the year 2007 at the age of 94 after having spent more than 50 years serving the healthcare needs of the people of Western North Dakota. Look at her, Sister Moira Paulus, ora et labora. And here's an image which touches many of our hearts here on the northern Great Plains. This is a French painting, the Angelus by Jean-François Millet, which is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, but it may as well have been painted here. We see here that image of the pioneer spirit, the synthesis of prayer and work, which is familiar to us in the lives of the German-Russian and Bohemian and Scandinavian settlers, and settlers of many nationalities who came here and who worked upon these prairies. Here's something, someone discovered in the year 2009 in the bottom of a box in a bookstore in London a 1939 public information poster that had the message, "Keep calm and carry on." And since then, of course, we've seen thousands of variations. Maybe you've seen them on t-shirts of this, "Keep calm and X." And here's one for you that I found. I thought it was so funny. "Keep calm and ora et labora." Keep calm, pray, and work. So I'd like to say that the topic that we take up today has to do with reconnecting Sunday and Monday, which is a new, but really it's an old vision of work, leisure, and their integration. Cardinal O'Brien, who will be treated with tomorrow, was on the campus this morning at the University of Mary for an encounter with the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. And we gave him a book called A Free and Hardy Life, a book written by North Dakota humanities scholar Clay Jenkinson about Theodore Roosevelt. Here's an excerpt from Roosevelt's biography, which he wrote in 1913. It's from a chapter called In Cowboy Land. He said that he had crossed the Red River in 1883 and come to take possession of 2 ranches on the Little Missouri. And he wrote, "It was still the Wild West in those days, the far west, the west of Owen Wister's stories and Frederick Remington's drawings, the west of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cowpuncher. That land of the west has gone now, gone with lost Atlantis. Gone to the Isle of Ghosts and of strange dead memories. It was a land of vast, silent spaces, of lonely rivers and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horsemen. It was a land of scattered ranches, of herds and long-horned cattle, and of reckless riders who unmoved looked in the eyes of life or of death. In that land we led a free and hardy life with horse and with rifle. We worked under the scorching midsummer sun, when the wide plains shimmered and wavered in the heat, and we knew the freezing misery of riding night guard round the cattle in the late fall roundup. In the soft springtime, the stars were glorious in our eyes each night before we fell asleep. And in the winter, we rode through blinding blizzards, when the driven snow dust burned our faces. There were monotonous days as we guided the trail cattle or the beef herds hour after hour at the slowest of walks, and minutes or hours teeming with excitement as we stopped stampedes or swam the herds across rivers treacherous with quicksands or brimmed with running ice. We knew toil and hardship and danger and hunger and thirst, and we saw men die violent deaths as they worked among the horses and cattle or fought evil feuds with one another. But we felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living. That makes the North Dakota heart pound strong, doesn't it? We felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living. This phrase, the glory of work and the joy of living, is a phrase which is so attractive to us because we know the meaning of work. And yet so often our work oppresses us and we become confused and we don't know in the midst of it the joy of living. Here's my thesis for this talk. If we don't get leisure right, we'll never get work right. Another way to put it is, if we don't get Sunday right, we'll never get Monday right. Here's a quote from a document released a couple of years ago from the Pontifical Council of Peace and Justice, called The Vocation of the Business Leader. Obstacles to serving the common good come in many forms: corruption, absence of the rule of law, tendencies toward greed, poor stewardship of resources. But the most significant obstacle to serving the common good for the business leader, and this is for all of us, on a personal level, is leading a divided life. The divided life is the great obstacle to happiness and to integration. So, a friend told me a story once. He grew up the children of Irish immigrants in Chicago. And one night, he was leaving to go out on a Saturday, and his father said to him, "Son, you be good now." And then thought for a little bit and said, "But if you can't be good, be careful. But if you can't be good, be careful." Well, there were a series of things which happened in the course of that night, and his dad ended up picking him up at a South Side police station. bailed him out of jail. They got into the car together. There was a long silence, and his father said, "Son, I think you better just be good." Being careful. We live in a culture that sees being careful as crucial to life and is somehow connected to good living and to achievement. We live in a culture of designated drivers and safe sex. We live in a culture which values education by speaking to our children of good test scores and checking all the boxes necessary to the next step, but failing to ask the deeper questions of why we go to school. We live in a culture in which we teach children to be go-getters rather than go-givers, more concerned about grades, athletic achievements, and other achievements than about the good of the souls of young people, the poor of our community, the problems of our society. Our career strategies guarantee income and security. They cluster around the notion of enlightened self-interest. And so we live a divided life, both individually and organizationally. Most of us would never say that being careful or making money or having status or honor are the goal of our lives, but we find ourselves falling into patterns as if they were. This is what a divided life looks like and feels like. And so the church in the modern world, the document of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, calls a divided life, a life in which we prioritize those things which are not first in their order, in which we live upside down lives, one of the most serious errors of our age. Here you see a picture of a rose window of a Gothic cathedral. Have any of you heard the story of the French architect Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc? He was commissioned to restore Notre Dame Cathedral after it had been largely defaced in the ravages of the French Revolution. But when he was a little boy, his mother took him to the cathedral, and he stood there in the transept of that great monument to God, and he was struck by the extraordinary beauty of the light that came through the rose window, and he said, "Écoute, maman, c'est la rosace qui chante." Listen, mama, the rose is singing. What he was experiencing, this little boy who would grow to become a great architect, was a vision of beauty. In the classical vision, in the medieval vision, beauty has three components: integritas, which means wholeness; consonantia, which means harmony; and claritas, which means radiance. In order for something to be beautiful, it has to be one. It has to have a wholeness and a wholesomeness about it. It has to have harmony. The different parts have to relate to each other in the proper proportion and in the proper order, and it needs to shine. There needs to be a radiance, a clarity about it. This is the way that we're meant to live our lives. God has given us our lives not so that we can live small lives, self-enclosed lives, lives that are a prison or a desperate search for meaning. He gives us our lives so that we might live beautiful lives. And so our lives too, in order to be beautiful, should seek after these components: integrity, wholeness, harmony, and radiance. And so we have to ask ourselves the big questions. First, what am I working for? This is a question we have to ask on a habitual basis. We work too much to deprive ourselves of a meaningful answer. And yet, a good answer will not come from work itself, since our work does not provide us the height or the depth of a good answer. We need to answer a second question, not what am I working for, but what am I resting in? What am I resting in? This is an odd question for us in America, and it's unlike the first one. It's odd because we rarely ask it, but we have to remember that we were made not only to work, but to rest. In Genesis, God shows us in how He creates the world that we were made to work and to rest. And Augustine, in his Confessions, famously says, "Our hearts were made for you, O God, and we are restless. We are weary. We are divided. We are lost. We are restless until we rest in you." What am I resting in? And this leads to the final question, what am I living for? This is the key to integration, to the wholeness which makes our lives beautiful. What am I living for? Work and leisure are not two periods of time in human life that we hold in balance with each other, but they're two moments in the integration of a person's life which exist only in their relation with one another. They are the building blocks of human experience. And so we're going to tackle this, everybody, using a table, a matrix, which can be helpful. It's helpful as a diagnostic tool, but if we push it too far, we'll find that we can't fit our lives into boxes. If we push it too far, we'll find that it won't be able to handle our experiences. But maybe, just maybe, working through this table will help us better to see our lives and how they're meant to be put together. And again, here's our thesis. If we don't get leisure right, we'll never get work right. If we don't get Sunday right, we'll never get Monday right. And so how we plan to proceed in the coming minutes is to start from the bottom and move across for three different visions of work, leisure, and their integration. Our vision, our idea of what work is, arises from that second question, what am I resting in? In other words, we get our idea of work from our idea of leisure. And those two components, work and leisure, how they relate to each other, spell how our lives come together, what the integration of our lives look like. So first, a first vision of work is to consider work as a job, as a thing for economic return. Here we focus on extrinsic motivation. In other words, we're motivated to work because of something which is outside of us. We often see our work in functional and technical ways, where the criteria of the bureaucrat tends to dominate: order, efficiency, profitability, consistency, growth, systems, structure, and on and on. And here we run up against the problem of measurement. We should be all for accountability, but in some instances, the more you measure something, the more you drive the spirit out of a thing. We see this from time to time in education. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the more you test your students, the more you grade them, the more burdensome education gets, which drives the love of learning out of the student. Albert Einstein said, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." So we see the problem, for instance, with lawyers and billable hours, where the time of an attorney boils down to segments and subsegments of an hour, which is worth $200 or $800 or whatever. Or doctors and nurses who are increasingly concerned about the commodification of medicine. Mike Royko, the Chicago journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1972 for commentary, said, "If work is so great, how come they pay us to do it?" This is a question which arises out of this mentality of work as a job. If it's so great, why do they pay us to do it? Why do we view work sometimes in this way? There are lots of reasons, but one has to do with our vision of leisure, leisure as amusement. Leisure as amusement. Our culture grounds itself in the trappings of entertainment. It's a vision of leisure where time off from the job is where real living takes place. We're living for the weekend. Look at how much we pay those who provide entertainment for us. Music, sports, and show business are the highest paid people in the society because we so value entertainment. Does anybody remember Billy Joel's song, Piano Man? He's playing a piano in a bar at the end of the week. People are coming in, they're spending the money that they made in the course of the week, and the bartender gives him a smile, because he knows it's been me they've been coming to see to forget about life for a while. This word, amuse, what's the source of it? It comes from the Muses. The Muses were the Greek goddesses of the liberal arts, the spirits who would refresh people and bring them back to their upright posture. But if you put an A in front of muse, you deny it, you cancel it. The word amuse comes to us from Middle English through Old French, amuser. It means to stupefy, to stare stupidly. To stare stupidly. It is a form of activity that brings not growth, but escape. And so we have this quote from Jacques Ellul, who was a French philosopher. Instead of being the moment when we rediscover ourselves, reflecting upon who we ought to be, leisure morphs into, is understood as the moment when amusements succeed to the maximum in making us forget. And so we get this vision, the weekend getaway, the place where real living takes place. What's meant by real? Real means the separation of mind and body. One of the most effective rebranding strategies of any city in the history of the world is the catchphrase of Las Vegas. Everything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. This is a kind of dumbed down leisure, a vegging out, a form of escape from work, from the world, from oneself. Whether it's in the form of weekend getaways, malls and shopping, casinos, spas, TV, movies, concerts, amusement parks, the internet, video games, strip joints. As a culture, we try to escape. We see leisure as vegging out. So real living is suppressed living. Real living is a suppression of our ends, of ourselves, not a revelation of our destiny and character. And this is a lack of self-development, rather than actually doing or creating things, which is what we were made to do. Rather than doing or creating things, individuals sit back and watch others do things. This underlying notion of amusement informs also our notion of celebration. Think about our holidays. The word holiday comes from holy day, and yet we've driven the holy out of it. Think of the commercialization of Christmas, the decadence of Mardi Gras and St. Patrick's Day, the over-sentimentality of Valentine's Day, the trivialization of Easter, the ghoulishness of Halloween. All of these celebrations have lost their religious character and have become, at their core, acts of consumption. And so when we have a vision of leisure as amusement, it informs a vision of work as job. And what's the integration? Gratification. Gratification. Materialist consumerism is primarily a perspective on leisure, an attitude about how we spend our leisure time. The focus of real living takes place outside of work, where relationships are largely understood in terms of their consumable character. And so work is secondary. It's understood only in terms of its economic or consumptive considerations. We work so that we have money to play. We work, why? So that we have money to play. This is a form of economism. One of the problems with consumerism, though, is that it undermines the very thing that it promises to give, freedom. Our freedom does not lie in what we are able to buy. And actually, our consumerism enslaves us. It becomes our own addiction. And so we see that the vision of work as job arises from the vision of leisure as amusement, which results in an integration, a purpose and meaning of life rooted in gratification. Here's a second vision, the vision of work as career. Here, work isn't just a job. Work has its psychological rewards. Unlike those in a job who tend to see work only as a means to an economic end, the careerist sees the inherent value of work. They realize work can be a source of self-esteem, creativity, and personal satisfaction. This vision of work is the vision of the high achiever in our society. And so let's look at the word career. It comes from the French word carrier, and the same word from which we get car. Like a car, our career serves as a vehicle to get from here to there. Our degrees, scores, grades, achievements, etc., are the vehicles that lead us to the next step. And so we travel alone in glass-enclosed privacy. Cars. Speaking of consumerism, this is the part of my talk sponsored by all the car dealerships who support the University of Mary and Marauders Athletics. In the same way that this talk is carefully honed to talk about the eternal rest which can come to you through Eastgate funeral services. So the careerist is not primarily money mad, but rather they're goal-oriented. They're focused on the thrill of accomplishment. But a careerist can tend toward preoccupation with himself or herself. What do I want to do? What fulfills me? What are my talents? What's the next step for me? And what arises out of this is a kind of sad and tragic social ignorance. A rare question for the careerist is, what does the world need from me? What's the common good and how can I contribute to it? And at the root of this is a lack of a spiritual calling. What is God asking from me in this world? Where do we get this view of work? From the same place, from a vision of leisure. A vision of leisure not of amusement, but as function. So the dominance of work in our culture has encroached upon our view of leisure in a way that we increasingly view our leisure primarily in terms of utility. That is, what its instrumental value is to my work. So 2 examples: education. Spending time and money on education in this vision only makes sense to get good grades, to get to the next step, to get a good career. But learning is not meant to be, first of all, an instrument for advancement, but something beautiful for its own sake. Here I just have to say, this contributes wildly to the deterioration of our universities, the best of which, in some instances, have become just high-tech trade schools, and not true universities which are focused upon the joy of learning and the pursuit of truth. Studying a poem or a star or a chemical equation might help us by making us smarter, but we first of all study them because they're beautiful. They are worth our wonder. Education. And second, a vision of rest. Rest, when we think about leisure as function, rest only makes sense so that we can sharpen the saw. Some of you recognize that I've borrowed this from Stephen Covey from his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is a state of mind that never leaves work. All time is ordered to and controlled by work time. I rest so I can sharpen the saw so that I'm better at my career. This leads, psychologists tell us, to a funny phenomenon called the Sunday afternoon neurosis. So people begin to slip into depression on Sunday afternoons. But if you do tests on them, there's nothing wrong with them. Maybe they just ate a little bit too much. They're not physically sick. What's wrong with people on Sunday afternoons? They're suffering from a very great disease. They're suffering from the Sabbath. We're too often afraid to give our time to Christ because it won't be useful. It won't achieve the hundreds of things I need to get done. But Pope St. John Paul II pushed back against this vision in a colossal way, and in fact issued a statement about it in Dies Domini. And he said, do not be afraid, never be afraid to give your time to Christ. He's the one who knows the secret of time and the secret of eternity, and he gives us his day as an ever-new gift of his love. The rediscovery of this day, Sunday, is a grace which we must implore, not only so that we may live the demands of faith to the full, but also so that we may respond concretely to the deepest human yearnings. Time given to Christ is never lost, but rather time gained. Listen to this. Time given to Christ is never lost, but rather time gained, so that our relationships and indeed our whole life may become more profoundly human. This view of leisure as function and work as career moves us to see our identity heavily and increasingly and only tied to our achievements, which is the integration of this second vision of work and leisure. The integration of our life then becomes achievement. This is the curse of careerism, where doing, our achievements, our status, takes precedence over being, our character, our relationships. Ours is a society that pegs status to overachievement. Be honest and look deep within yourself. We've all got it, don't we? We can't help but admiring the workaholic. And so we take that disease upon ourselves. I do it. We focus on outside achievement at the expense of interior or spiritual maturity. And when this happens, we shrivel up and we become very small. When we live without prayer, without Sabbath, We suddenly are not able to offer ourselves. We don't have ourselves anymore to offer. We've lost ourselves. All we've got are our accomplishments, and that's a pretty pitiful offering to give to anyone, especially to God. All we're left with is our accomplishments, and this is a life without love. And so I have two case studies for you, two examples of when this can happen. The first is the example of someone who many of you remember, Lee Iacocca. Lee Iacocca, the CEO who left Ford and rescued the Chrysler Corporation, becoming its chairman. A couple of years after leaving Chrysler, Lee Iacocca was on the front cover of Fortune magazine with this caption, look at it, "How I Flunked Retirement." Talks about his second divorce, his lonely life in Bel Air. Here is a titan of American industry, an economic giant at work, but if you pick up the article and if you read it, by his own account, in retirement, he struggled a lot. He felt himself as a spiritual dwarf. Here's a second case, LBJ. So if you pick up Doris Kearns Goodwin's biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson, she says, here's a man who should have lived his last years with great satisfaction, power, monetary wealth, status. Listen to this, though. It's so heartbreaking. And yet, the man I saw in his retirement had spent so many years in the pursuit of work, power, and individual success that he had absolutely no psychic or emotional resources left to commit himself to anything once the presidency was taken from him. Years of concentration solely on work meant that in his retirement he could find no solace in recreation, sports, or hobbies. And LBJ died at the age of 64, a relatively young man, almost 4 years to the day after he left office. I think it was 1 or 2 days after Nixon was sworn in for his second term. The lesson here is this: our work is never merely about what we achieve. Our work is never merely about what we achieve. It's not about our accomplishments. Our work is about who we become. Do you remember the American comedian Lily Tomlin? She said, the problem with the rat race is if you win, you're still a rat. Our work is never merely about what we achieve, it's about who we become. Our choices, everyone, our choices, the choices that we make in regard to work and leisure, our choices in regard to work and leisure determine our destiny. Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. And watch your character, it becomes your destiny. And so then we have the second tier of this table, of this matrix. A vision of work not as simple job, but as career, which arises out of a vision of leisure as function and brings together our life in a very unsatisfactory integration of achievement. What does this tell us? Everybody, it tells us that we have a problem. In particular, we have a cultural problem and a profoundly moral and spiritual problem of how we look at work and leisure. And the only remedy for a spiritual problem is a remedy which is spiritual at its core. I want to take us on just a very brief diversion before I jump in to the last segment of this table. Take a look here. This is a medieval bas-relief of the institution of marriage from the Salisbury Cathedral Chapter House in England. It's an image of God with Adam and Eve. The dynamics of God's mercy, and this is the Jubilee year of mercy, which is a profound and desperately important gift which our Holy Father has given us in the midst of a world in which there's not much mercy, in a world in which everything is permitted and nothing is forgiven. In that harsh world in which we live now, a world without mercy, we have this holy year to enter into the mystery of mercy. And what that means in respect to our current topic goes back to the very beginning of when human beings were knit together for the very first time, and the human project, the destiny and the adventure of human life was launched for the first time. Those dynamics of God's mercy are those dynamics out of which we were created. Deep within us they are, but they're scrambled by the confusion and the woundedness of sin. Remember how God creates the cosmos. He creates the whole world through a series of blessings. At the end of every day, when God creates, at the end of every day, He saw that it was good. And this is a blessing. The word blessing, benedicere, means to speak well of something, to name something as good. And so God, at the end of every day of creation, gives a blessing. And then the sixth day is the day of His masterpiece. The creation which would share His very image and likeness, His masterpiece, humanity. And on creating us, on creating the human family, He saw that we were very good. Here there is a double blessing. And if you open that old book and you blow the dust off and look at the story out of which we arose, you find these words: God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. He blessed them, and He said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So the blessing comes first, and then the fruitfulness. We are productive, our lives are meaningful and impressive. We are triumphant and happy because God has blessed us first, as a result of His blessing. What happens in the tragedy of sin is that we reverse the order. The lie of the enemy, the whole tragic mindset of the fallen heart is this: if you are fruitful, then you will receive the blessing. If you are fruitful, then you will receive the blessing. And this wounded attitude contaminates our lives and our relationships. What happens when we adopt this wounded, fallen mindset? If I get good grades, my parents and teacher would like me. If I were good at sports, my dad would notice me. If I dress like this and have a sharp, witty sense of humor, I'll be popular. People will like me. If I could just be that wife my husband needs, he would be tender again. If I get this account for my company, they'll give me a promotion and a raise. And if I could overcome my sins, then God would love me. This is called chasing the blessing. It's exhausting. And it's exhausting because we're trying to do something that's never been done, which can't be done. We make ourselves miserable because we're trying to earn something which can only ever be a gift. And mercy untangles the knots into which we tie ourselves and sets things right again. God's mercy is His joy in us, the joy that we should exist, the joy that we should be His children, that joy meeting our misery and our exhaustion and making us whole. We receive the gift of mercy, we receive it, the blessing, and then we're able to see that the blessing was chasing behind us all the time. We just needed to stop and let ourselves be caught. And so here's the final vision of work, leisure, and their integration. Work as vocation. The word vocation comes from vocare. You all know this. It's a calling to give, a call to be human, the universal call to love, to be whole, to holiness. It's a matter of being, of character. Man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. This was the favorite passage from the Second Vatican Council of St. John Paul II, from Gaudium et Spes. It was his favorite, partly because he wrote it. Man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. We tell this to our students at the University of Mary all the time. You'll never find happiness, you'll never find meaning until you find a way to give yourselves away in love. That's the meaning of our lives, which are gifts meant to be given. It's a call to be human. It's a call to a state of life, to belonging, to give ourselves to our personal calling, to marriage or religious life, to priesthood, to the single state. Our vocation, Our vocation is a call to a state of life and a call to a particular way of work, of doing. Our work allows us to exercise our gifts in serving others through servant leadership, not through leadership which clamors for power. Do you remember the story of the Native Americans surprised at the Pilgrims? They were so shocked by the Pilgrims, by the behavior of these people who had come upon their shores, because they would give them gifts and then the Pilgrims would hoard and keep the gifts. They couldn't understand it. There's very great wisdom here. Unless given away in turn, the gifts we receive corrupt us. Unless we find a way to give them away, the gifts we receive corrupt us. This is primarily true about the gift of our lives. Unless we find a way to give our life away, that gift will become despair and corruption. So this vision of work as vocation arises out of a vision of leisure as contemplation. Not a matter of achievement, but of receivement. When you're a college president, you get to make up words. Receivement. Our lives of vocation and leisure are not about achievement on our part, but of receivement, as we consider what has been given to us and what we can offer then in return. Pope Benedict XVI beautifully said, a person comes in the profoundest sense to himself, not through what he does, but through what he accepts, not through what he achieves, but through what he receives. And so I want to propose to you, everybody, today, 3 habits which get us into this mindset. 3 habits which should be a part of our lives as Catholics, as Christians, as believers, as disciples. 3 things which should be a part of each of our lives in terms of leisure. First, a habit of solitude. A habit of solitude. Here is silence, stillness, centeredness. Our lives are plagued, everybody, our lives are plagued by emotional tapes, audio tapes, videotapes, which play all the time inside of our heads. A divided life generates these tapes. Do you know what I'm talking about? I mean the tapes where we're watching or hearing inside of the noise of our heads, the illusions of grandeur of who I think I am, the feelings of unappreciated genius, the debate scenarios of great victories, the award speeches, those tapes. These tapes prevent rest. They prevent rest. They keep us restless, worried, consumed with concern, self-concern. We need rest in our lives. We need rest from ourselves, from our tapes, from our self-importance, our sarcasm, our cynicism. Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for yourselves, for my yoke is easy and my burden light." He doesn't mean for our lives to be so heavy, so difficult, so shameful. He doesn't mean for us to live like that, and we don't have to live like that. And so we need in our lives a habit of daily silence. In silence there is clarity, honesty, insight that is lost in the noise of our day. Only the silent hear. I tell our students at the University of Mary, if you want to learn how to pray, the first thing you have to do is let God look at you. Let him look at you. He created you so that he can see you. He created you because he loves to look at you. And that silence, when we experience the gaze of God in his mercy, renews us and gives us rest. So the first habit, a habit of solitude. Second, a habit of celebration, of Sabbath, of feast. Again, if we don't get Sunday night right, we won't get Monday right. The Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel states there is a realm of time where the goal is not to have but to be, not to own but to give, not to control but to share, not to subdue but to be in accord. The Sabbath is a clear witness that production and consumption do not own us. Again, St. John Paul II in his letter Dies Domine says, far from being an escape, the Christian Sunday is a prophecy inscribed on time itself, a prophecy obliging the faithful to follow in the footsteps of the one who came to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to captives and new sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim a jubilee year, a year acceptable to the Lord. And this is the context of the third commandment. When God leads Israel out into the desert to Mount Sinai, he gives them the 10 commandments. Most of them seem like common sense. Don't kill, steal, commit adultery, and lie. But the third commandment seems so strange. Do not work on the Sabbath day. On that day, rest. What does that mean? What it means is it's context. He just set them free from slavery. He just set them free from slavery, and he said, I just set you free. You're not slaves anymore, so don't live like slaves. Slaves work all the time. They never rest. They have no time for their family. They have no time for themselves. They have no time for me. Do not live like slaves. We need the habit of Sabbath, and this is something which we have to restore to our lives if we're to find holiness. And finally, a habit of service, going to the margins, to be with those who on the surface can't do anything for us, but actually who can do more for us than we could ever do for them as we serve them. Jean Vanier, who was the founder of the L'Arche communities, said if we remain at the level of doing something for people when we serve, we stay behind the barriers of our superiority. To serve people, my brother, my sister, in this year of the canonization of Saint Mother Teresa, who says that Jesus comes to us all the time in a distressing disguise. In her honor, and in response to the commandment of Christ, let's integrate into our lives habits of service. When we stop chasing the blessing, we're able to find ourselves in losing ourselves, which is the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that brings us to the end. Integration, which is a matter of integrity. Integritas, not a balanced life, not finding some crazy work-life balance, which is some type of a contemporary myth made up by people who write books for the self-help section. No, integritas is not a balanced life, but a whole life, an integrated life. Have you ever heard the story of William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet, who more than halfway through his life was feeling like a failure? And he was in London on a street corner, sitting at a table, and he had an empty pocket and an empty glass. This is a terrible thing for an Irishman, to be in England with nothing to drink. Terrible. And at a certain point, though, as he looked out, he was jostled from his sadness, and he received the gift of grace. And he was lost in wonder at the beauty of the world in which he lived. And he wrote this. This is from his poem Vacillation. He said, while on the shop and street I gazed, my body of a sudden blazed. In 20 minutes more or less, it seemed so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless. I was blessed and could bless. Dear friends, when we stop chasing the blessing, when we let God bless us, when we experience our work as vocation, a call to give, when we experience leisure as contemplation, a rest, an act of receivement, not achievement, and when those come together in a kind of integration which brings our life into a form of wholeness through habits of silence, Sabbath, and service, then all of a sudden we can receive the blessing, and then we can bless others with the lives we live. And that, by the way, is how you become a saint. So here it is. Work, leisure, and their integration. Here we find a beautiful vision of work as vocation, a kind of giving. Leisure is contemplation, fundamentally receiving. And their integration is integrity, which is a matter of being. Now a quote which many of you have heard from that great champion of Catholic higher education, the author of The Idea of a University, Blessed John Henry Newman. As you reflect on your life in the light of the small things which I've said today, as you think about why you're here, what God wants from you, and how your life can be more beautiful, more joyful, more full, more integrated, think on these words so famous of Blessed John Henry Newman. God created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I am as necessary in my place as an archangel in his. I have my mission. I never may know it fully in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary to his purposes. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. He has not created me for nothing. Do you believe that, dear friends, here in this Thirst Conference? Do you believe that your life is as important to God as the life and the vocation and the work of the archangels? Well, I'm here to tell you that that's true, and those are my thoughts on work, life, and mercy. Thanks for listening, everybody. God bless you.